72 hours from now, the United States of America will be forced to make a decision that no American president has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Right now, at this very moment, the Pentagon has three options on the table. None of them are good, and every minute that passes makes the choice harder. Option one is to accept what Iran has just done and watch as the strategic architecture of American power in the Indo-Pacific unravels in real time. Option two is to respond militarily to Iran's action and risk triggering a direct confrontation with China in the South China Sea that could escalate beyond any human being's ability to control. Option three is to negotiate, which would require the United States to acknowledge publicly and irreversibly that it no longer has the power to dictate the terms of global security in two theaters simultaneously. Three options, 72 hours, and a clock that is ticking so loudly that you can hear it in every war room, every situation room, in every intelligence briefing center from Washington to Beijing to Moscow. What Iran just did was not a military strike. It was not a missile launch. It was not an act of terrorism or an attack on American forces. What Iran did at approximately 0900 hours Tehran time on the morning of May 7th, 2026, was far more dangerous than any of those things. Iran signed a comprehensive mutual defense and strategic partnership treaty with the People's Republic of China, a treaty that includes, according to the preliminary text being analyzed across diplomatic and intelligence channels, a mutual defense clause that obligates each signatory to treat an armed attack against the other as an attack against itself. In the language of international security, this is a mutual defense pact. In the language of strategic reality, this means that the American military campaign against Iran, the carrier groups, the B-1B bombers, the maritime interdiction, the economic strangulation, the multi-domain pressure campaign that this channel has been documenting since its inception has just become, in legal and strategic terms, an American military campaign against the nation that is now formally allied with the world's second largest nuclear power, the world's largest conventional military, and the world's second largest economy. The clock started at 0900. 72 hours is the window that defense analysts estimate the Pentagon has before the strategic implications of the treaty become operationally irreversible. Before Chinese naval assets currently conducting exercises in the South China Sea reposition to demonstrate capability in waters adjacent to the Persian Gulf. Before Chinese satellite and electronic warfare assets are formally integrated into Iranian air defense networks. And before the diplomatic space for a negotiated de-escalation closes permanently. How did Iran, a nation on the brink of economic collapse, manage to secure a mutual defense pact with China? What did Tehran offer Beijing that was valuable enough to bring China into a direct strategic confrontation with the United States? What specific military capabilities does China now bring to Iran's defense? And how do they change the operational calculus for every American commander in the Gulf? And how did American intelligence fail to see this coming when the signs in retrospect were visible for months? Stay with us because this is the most dangerous story in the world right now. If you want raw, no-nonsense analysis that follows the escalation ladder to its logical and terrifying conclusion, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments because the next 72 hours may be the most consequential in modern history. The treaty did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from the wreckage of the American pressure campaign's own success. As this channel documented in detail, the American multi-domain offensive against Iran, the naval interdiction, the financial network destruction, the THAAD deployments, the dual carrier strike group presence, achieved its tactical objectives with devastating efficiency. Too much efficiency. The rial collapsed past 4 million to the dollar. Iranian oil exports were physically interdicted by American warships. The IRGC's financial networks were dismantled node by node. The regime was cornered, desperate, and running out of options at a speed that left no room for the kind of face-saving diplomatic off-ramp that historically allows pressured regimes to back down without appearing to capitulate. When a regime has no exit, it does not surrender. It finds a new ally. And Iran found the only ally on earth powerful enough to change the equation overnight. The negotiations between Tehran and Beijing, according to intelligence assessments being discussed in diplomatic circles, were conducted through a back channel that bypassed both nations' foreign ministries and was managed directly by the IRGC's Strategic Intelligence Directorate and a senior official within the Chinese Communist Party's Central Military Commission. The channel operated outside the awareness of standard diplomatic reporting, which is why American intelligence, focused on monitoring Iranian foreign ministry communications and conventional diplomatic traffic, reportedly failed to detect the negotiations until the treaty text was already in final draft. The intelligence failure is significant, but not surprising. The American intelligence community was looking for a diplomatic negotiation. What it should have been looking for was a strategic transaction. The transaction at the heart of the treaty is brutally simple in its logic, but vast in its strategic implications. Iran offered China what China has wanted for decades: guaranteed, long-term, below-market price access to Iranian oil and natural gas reserves, estimated at approximately 157 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves and 34 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, the second and first largest reserves in the world, respectively. Under the treaty's energy provisions, Iran reportedly commits to supplying China with a guaranteed minimum of 3 million barrels of crude oil per day at a fixed discount of $25 below benchmark prices, secured by a 50-year supply agreement that gives China energy security independent of the maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, that American naval power currently controls. The financial value of this commitment at current prices is approximately $27 billion per year in guaranteed revenue for Iran, revenue that flows directly from the world's second-largest economy through channels that the United States Treasury cannot designate or interdict because they will operate under the protection of Chinese state banking infrastructure. But the energy provisions are only half of what Iran offered. The treaty reportedly includes basing rights for Chinese naval and air assets at Iranian ports on the Gulf of Oman, specifically at Chabahar and Jask, positions that give the PLA Navy access to the Indian Ocean without transiting the Strait of Malacca, the choke point through which 80% of Chinese oil imports currently pass, and which is patrolled by the United States Navy and its allies. For Chinese strategic planners, the Malacca dilemma, the vulnerability of China's energy supply to American interdiction at the Strait, has been the central anxiety of Chinese grand strategy for 2 decades. The Iran treaty solves it in a single stroke. If Chinese tankers can load Iranian crude at ports on the Gulf of Oman and escort them through the Indian Ocean under the protection of Chinese naval vessels operating from Iranian bases, then the Malacca choke point becomes optional rather than essential. This is not just an energy deal. It is the dissolution of the single greatest strategic vulnerability that has constrained Chinese power projection since the end of the Cold War. In exchange, China offers Iran the one thing that no other nation on earth can provide: a security guarantee backed by the People's Liberation Army, the world's largest military, with approximately 2 million active-duty personnel, a nuclear arsenal of an estimated 350 warheads and growing, a navy of over 370 warships, including 3 aircraft carriers, and a missile force that includes the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, known as the Carrier Killer, with a range of 4,000 kilometers and the ability to strike moving naval targets at sea with a conventional or nuclear warhead. The DF-21D, another anti-ship ballistic missile in the PLA arsenal, carries a maneuvering warhead designed to defeat the Aegis missile defense systems that protect American carrier strike groups at ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers. The Mutual Defense Clause means that any American military action against Iran, any strike, any interdiction, any engagement, now carries the risk of a Chinese military response. Not a diplomatic protest, not a United Nations veto, a military response from a nuclear-armed superpower with the industrial base to sustain a prolonged confrontation and the missile inventory to threaten American naval assets across two oceans simultaneously. The countdown is running. The clock that started at 0900 Tehran time is now past the 24-hour mark. And in the hours since the treaty was announced, the strategic landscape has shifted with a speed that has left American planners struggling to keep up. The first operational indicator came within 6 hours of the announcement, when Chinese Navy vessels participating in a previously scheduled exercise in the northern South China Sea altered course and began repositioning toward the eastern Indian Ocean. The task force reportedly includes the Shandong, China's second aircraft carrier, a 60,000-ton conventionally powered vessel carrying J-15 Flying Shark multi-role fighters with a combat radius of over 1,200 kilometers, accompanied by at least two Type 055 Renhai-class cruisers, the most heavily armed surface combatants in any Asian navy, displacing 13,000 tons each and carrying 112 vertical launch cells loaded with a mix of YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 540 kilometers and HHQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missiles. The repositioning does not constitute a deployment to the Persian Gulf. It constitutes a demonstration, a signal that Chinese naval power can reach the Indian Ocean approaches within days, and that American naval dominance in the waters between the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz is no longer uncontested. The second indicator came from space. Within 12 hours of the treaty announcement, American intelligence reportedly detected the activation of additional Chinese Beidou navigation satellite ground stations in western China's Xinjiang province, stations whose coverage pattern is optimized for precision-guided weapons targeting in Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Simultaneously, Chinese Yaogan reconnaissance satellites, the military surveillance constellation that provides targeting data for PLA missile forces, adjusted their orbital parameters to increase revisit rates over the Persian Gulf from approximately once every 18 hours to approximately once every 6 hours. China is not deploying troops to Iran. It is deploying eyes and ears, the satellite infrastructure that would allow Chinese precision-guided weapons to engage targets in the Gulf theater from launch positions deep inside Chinese territory. The third indicator is diplomatic. Within 18 hours of the treaty announcement, the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations requested an emergency session of the Security Council to address what Beijing described as the illegal American naval blockade of Iranian maritime commerce. The move is procedurally symbolic. The United States would veto any resolution, but strategically significant because it forces the international community to choose sides and frames the American pressure campaign against Iran as an issue of international law rather than bilateral policy. China is building the diplomatic architecture for a confrontation while simultaneously positioning the military assets to prosecute one. In Washington, the reaction has been described by multiple sources as the most intense national security crisis of the current administration, more acute than the Fitzgerald engagement, more strategically consequential than the Canadian trade confrontation, more fundamentally threatening to American global position than any single event since the September 11th attacks. The National Security Council has been in continuous session since the treaty announcement. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have reportedly briefed the president on the full range of military options, from continued pressure against Iran under the existing campaign to a potential redeployment of forces from the Gulf to the Indo-Pacific to counter the Chinese naval repositioning. The Secretary of Defense has reportedly requested an emergency review of all force disposition plans and asked the combatant commanders for Central Command and Indo-Pacific Command to present competing resource allocation proposals within 24 hours, a process that is itself generating institutional friction because each command considers its own theater the priority. The fundamental problem is one of strategic geometry that no amount of political will can solve. The United States maintains roughly 11 carrier strike groups. 2 are currently deployed in the Persian Gulf for the Iran campaign. 1 is in the Western Pacific. The remaining 8 are in various stages of maintenance, training, and home port rotation, cycles that cannot be accelerated without degrading the material readiness of ships that are designed for specific maintenance intervals. Surging additional carrier groups to either theater requires pulling them from the other, creating a zero-sum equation in which reinforcing the Gulf weakens the Pacific and reinforcing the Pacific weakens the Gulf. This is the trap. This is what Iran understood and what the Pentagon, consumed by the tactical brilliance of its own pressure campaign, failed to anticipate. Iran has forced the United States to fight a two-front strategic competition with a military that was designed, budgeted, and structured by the Pentagon's own 2018 National Defense Strategy for one major theater and one secondary theater, not for 2 simultaneous peer-level confrontations against adversaries that are now cooperating to ensure the two-front scenario materializes. In Moscow, the reaction has been one of strategic opportunism, barely concealed behind diplomatic language. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement calling for dialogue and de-escalation, the standard formula, while Russian state media has been broadcasting the Iran-China treaty as evidence of a new multipolar world order emerging to challenge American hegemony. The Kremlin's calculation is straightforward. A United States that is simultaneously confronting Iran in the Gulf and managing a potential confrontation with China in the Pacific has significantly fewer resources available for supporting Ukraine, reinforcing NATO's eastern flank, or maintaining the Arctic presence that Russia considers a threat. The Iran-China treaty does not directly benefit Russia. It indirectly benefits Russia by stretching the American military across a strategic geometry that Moscow has been trying to create for years, a world in which American power is spread so thin that it cannot concentrate decisive force in any single theater. In Tokyo, Seoul, and across the Indo-Pacific, the reaction has been one of acute alarm. Japan and South Korea depend on American security guarantees that assume the United States can project overwhelming military force into the Western Pacific. If American naval assets are locked in the Persian Gulf, confronting an Iran that is now backed by China, then the credibility of those guarantees is directly questioned. Taiwan, which has been the central focus of Chinese military planning for decades, faces the most dangerous implication of all: a scenario in which the United States is so consumed by the Gulf crisis that its ability to respond to a Chinese move against Taiwan is materially degraded. The Taiwan Strait is approximately 180 kilometers wide. A Chinese amphibious operation across it would require naval and air superiority that the PLA cannot achieve while the American 7th Fleet is operating at full strength in the Western Pacific. But if the 7th Fleet's carrier group has been redeployed to the Gulf, or if the fleet is operating at reduced readiness because of the two-front strain, then the window for a Chinese operation narrows toward the possible. Across European capitals, the concern centers on the NATO implications, and they are severe. If the United States is drawn into a two-front confrontation with both Iran and China, European allies face a security environment in which American reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank, already stretched by the ongoing commitment to Ukraine, becomes even less reliable. The scenarios that European defense planners have quietly wargamed for years, a world in which the United States cannot simultaneously defend Europe, manage the Middle East, and deter China, have just become operational reality rather than theoretical exercises. European defense ministers are reportedly holding emergency consultations about the implications for NATO's defense posture and whether European nations need to accelerate their own military spending dramatically, moving beyond the 2% of GDP target that most still have not met, to compensate for potential American redeployments that could leave the European continent more exposed than at any point since the end of the Cold War. In the Gulf states, the reaction has been one of existential recalculation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other Gulf monarchies have built their security architectures on the assumption of permanent American military presence. A Chinese mutual defense pact with Iran introduces a variable that no Gulf security planner has ever had to model: the possibility that American military action in the Gulf could trigger a confrontation with China that makes the Gulf itself a secondary theater, that American forces could be redeployed to the Pacific, and that the Gulf states would be left facing Iran without the American security umbrella they have depended on for 4 decades. The lessons from this moment are being written in real time, and they will define the strategic landscape for a generation. First, the American pressure campaign against Iran was tactically brilliant and strategically blind. It achieved every objective it set: economic collapse, military deterrence, proxy network disruption, without considering the possibility that a cornered regime with no exit would seek an alliance with the one power capable of neutralizing American military superiority. The campaign broke Iran economically while pushing Iran strategically into the arms of America's most dangerous competitor. The operation was a masterpiece of execution and a catastrophe of strategic foresight. Second, the era of American single-theater dominance is over. The Iran-China treaty has created the one scenario that American defense planners have feared since the end of the Cold War: a simultaneous two-front strategic competition against adversaries in different hemispheres that exceeds the capacity of the American military to manage with existing force structure. The United States can dominate the Gulf or the Pacific. It cannot dominate both at the same time against adversaries that are now coordinating their strategies to ensure it has to try. Third, Iran has demonstrated that weakness can be converted into leverage. A nation on the verge of economic collapse, with its currency in free fall, its oil interdicted, and its military encircled, managed to reshape the global balance of power by offering the one asset it still possessed: its energy reserves, to the one buyer that valued them highly enough to provide a security guarantee in return. Desperation is not the opposite of strategy. It is sometimes the mother of it. Fourth, China has crossed a threshold from which there is no return. A mutual defense pact with Iran is not a trade agreement that can be quietly revised or a diplomatic communique that can be walked back. It is a binding strategic commitment that ties China's credibility to Iran's survival. If the United States attacks Iran and China does not respond, the Mutual Defense Pact is exposed as empty, and China's credibility as a strategic partner is destroyed globally, not just in Tehran, but in Moscow, in Islamabad, in Pyongyang, in every capital that might consider a Chinese security guarantee as an alternative to American dominance. China has bet its international reputation on a commitment that it must now be prepared to honor, and the consequences of that bet extend far beyond the Gulf into every region where Chinese strategic partnerships are being considered or negotiated. Fifth, the world just learned what happens when the most powerful nation on earth corners an adversary without leaving an exit. Every military strategist, from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz, understood that a surrounded enemy must be given a route of retreat. The American pressure campaign sealed every exit, economic, diplomatic, military, and Iran, with nowhere to retreat, charged forward into the only opening remaining. That opening led to Beijing. And now the world lives with the consequences of a campaign that was designed to force surrender, but produced an alliance instead. The clock is still running. The window is closing. 52 hours remain before the initial repositioning of Chinese naval assets brings the Shandong carrier group within operational range of the Indian Ocean approaches to the Persian Gulf. 48 hours remain before the Chinese Beidou targeting adjustments are complete, and the PLA rocket force has precision coverage of the Gulf theater. 36 hours remain before the UN Security Council emergency session forces a public vote that will crystallize the international community's alignment into competing blocs. And somewhere inside the Pentagon, American planners are staring at a map that shows two oceans, two adversaries, and not enough ships to cover both. The world is about to find out what happens when the most powerful nation on Earth runs out of good options and the clock runs out of time. Stay vigilant, stay informed. What do you think? Does the United States back down from Iran and preserve its Pacific position? Double down in the Gulf and risk the Pacific? Or is there a third option that no one has seen yet? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, stay sharp.